Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to this month's theme. I call it theme because we're coming up to the end of the year where most organizations implement what is known as change freeze, where you're supposed to not do anything on existing systems, keep it up and running, stable, reliable, highly available, keep it as it is, because typically within the holiday seasons, this is the time, depending on which industry you're in, this is the time when holiday traffic, internet and business traffic comes in, like especially if you're in retail and you're in large or in an industry where you're selling stuff online. So typically in the United States, it usually starts off during United States Thanksgiving, from Black Friday all the way up until like first week of January. In some parts of the world, it starts during the Christmas season, because this is where they start offering Christmas stuff. They're selling Christmas stuff online. And so change freeze is that time of the year where let's pause any major changes on the system, keep everything up and running, and just make sure that everything's running fine and not introduce any hiccups. Unfortunately, the reality is we don't really know what's going to happen. We can't predict what could potentially happen. And that's why even during change freeze, you have to be ready for anything that could potentially happen. Now, this week's topic, I call it the DBA's Change Freeze Survival Guide. The reason I call it the survival guide is because, again, there are no major changes happening on the systems. Whether it's infrastructure, projects going on, they're kept on a pause. Which means, depending on how you manage your project managers are probably rushing through things so that before a change freeze happen, they've already completed the major projects. But as a database administrator managing high availability and or disaster recovery solutions, just because it is change freeze doesn't mean you'll just sit back, relax, and not do anything, right? I call it the survival guide because, again, we don't really know what's going to happen during holiday seasons, even though there's no major change or no major changes happening to the system. There could potentially be issues and problems and challenges that could happen during change freeze. And keep in mind, you also have to assume that people are out and about because it's the holidays. They probably filed for their 2-week vacation during the holiday season. And so change freeze could be I talked about this in the last episode where you got like your skeleton crew and there's not a lot of people on staff, but you have to be ready. Okay, grab your pen and paper. I want to start diving into the change freeze survival guide for the DBA. First one is what I call the pre-freeze database health check. If you haven't started change freeze yet, okay, again, some organizations, usually they would start before Christmas. If you haven't started your change freeze yet, run a database health check. Okay, do some audits. Make sure that you are, make sure that your entire database platform is healthy, stable, reliable, highly available before you even get on and start with change freeze. Because the last thing you want is to be caught off guard thinking, oh, everything's working fine, but you're blindsided by things that you're not aware of. Okay? It's interesting because a lot of companies have monitoring tools in place, but they only get alerted when something goes wrong. Right? That's a typical monitoring solution, right? You create alerts for potential issues, but you're not really sure if there's a critical issue underneath that isn't being picked up by your monitoring tool. So run a database health check before you get into change freeze. That way you still have time between today and before your change freeze start to make changes. Again, change freeze isn't happening yet, so if you catch any issue while you're doing database health check, you can pick up on them, submit emergency, well, not really emergency because change freeze hasn't happened yet, but get them done. Fix them as soon as possible so that you can be ready before change freeze happens. Again, do a quick audit on all of your mission critical database environment. Run health checks. I created what I call an automated health check for always on availability groups, end to end for the entire infrastructure, mainly because, again, these are times when you have to do this on a regular basis. You have to monitor the health and stability and reliability of your systems, and it's not enough for you to just rely on your monitoring tools. Sure, your monitoring tools will pick up on any issue, but that becomes reactive. You want to be proactive so that when change freeze happens and then all of a sudden there's massive influx of database transactions, you're now prepared for whatever would come next. Okay, so database health check, you do it before change freeze happens so that you still have time between the time you ran the health check, finding out what issues need to be solved, and before change freeze, so you can make the necessary modifications or changes, just again with the goal of making sure that the database platform is stable, reliable, and highly available. Okay, so that's the first one. Make sure you do your database health check before change freeze starts. The second one is what I call a pre-approved emergency runbook. Simply put, checklists. Okay. Why do I call these emergency runbooks? There's runbooks for normal day-to-day operations. Your runbook for normal day-to-day operations are part of your operational procedures or standard operating procedures. Like, for instance, you get an alert, this is what you do. Oh, we need to make modifications to this. You submit a change request gets approved, and then you implement that change request. Okay, and I hope you followed. Imagine a normal standard operating procedure for receiving an alert. You get an alert, you open a ticket to address the alert, you realize that there needs to be change. Okay, there's something that needs to be changed as part of you addressing that alert. You submit a change request form. Change request form gets approved by whoever, manager, IT director, and then you implement the change request, you close the ticket. That is your standard operating procedure, and I do hope that you have standardized all of these operating procedures because, again, it's very difficult to work on what I call tribal information, meaning, oh, only Ben knows how to do that, or somebody who built the system already left and he did not walk us through how this is properly done. Okay, that's why it is important for you to come up with standard operating procedures or your normal operational runbook. But there are cases like change freeze where you cannot just rely on your operational runbooks or your normal operational runbooks. Why? Again, you can't implement changes. Okay, you cannot implement changes during change freeze. So there has to be what is called a pre-approved emergency runbook, meaning if you walk through potential emergencies and you know for a fact that this is something that needs to be done to resolve the emergency, you create that checklist, have it pre-approved, so even if it's change freeze, the approval will then exempt that change and be applied to the system. Again, there's a big difference between completely not allowed to make changes versus emergency changes. Okay, like for instance, making modification to the database or table schema. That's a major change. However, failing over a node or failing over an availability group to another node, that's not a change, although it's a change in state. But if, for instance, the database or applications froze and they could not access the database because it's offline, failing over an availability group from one replicate to another could be a state change, but it is not a major change. It's a big difference. So excuse me, make sure that you get those things pre-approved, put it in an emergency run book so that if an emergency like that happens, you no longer need to request for change to fail over something. And again, because it's pre-approved, you can go ahead and do it. Like for instance, oh, the cluster service is frozen while the node is still up and running. You kill the process, restart the process. That's not a major change, but it is a state change. But make sure that you are allowed to even do that. Okay, so stuff like the incident response. How do you handle an incident during emergency change freeze? Like I said, a normal standard operating procedure would mean you get an alert, you open a ticket, you look at the alert and the issue, you realize there needs to be some change, you submit a change request gets approved before you can even do something. An incident response during change freeze is completely different because the person you might be submitting your change request form to might be on vacation. But if you have an incident response checklist and you know for a fact that, hey, we just need to reboot the machine, or we just need to fail over the AG, or we need to kill the cluster service and restart it, and they've been pre-approved, and you can build that into an emergency response checklist. Even emergency access procedures. How are you moving forward if this specific emergency happens? And this requires a lot of thinking about potential issues and potential problems. Okay, because it's very difficult to imagine potential problems that you've never experienced before, right? But this is where you start looking at previous history from your ticketing system on how or what kinds of issues that could potentially happen, and then you plan for those. Okay, your ticketing system, and I do hope you have a ticketing system and well documented. You can look at history of some of the previous incidents. How did people respond? How long did it take for resolution to come in? All of those, document them and come up with an emergency access procedure or an incident response checklist as well. Okay, so pre-approved emergency run book, make sure that it is approved by somebody before change freeze. And categorize the difference between this is an emergency change versus a major change. Okay, again, classifying the difference between I am, like for instance, index rebuilds is not a major change. You're just rebuilding the index as part of day-to-day operations. That you can do on during change freeze, but potentially creating an index if the workload becomes slow, unexpectedly slow during the holiday season, then you can also add that as a pre-approved change. Okay, nothing major happening in the database structure. You're just adding index, so go ahead again. But make sure that they're pre-approved so that by the time it actually happens, you have a checklist of what you need to do, and you don't need for approval anymore because they've been pre-approved. The third one is, this is very challenging as well, especially if you haven't done it before. I call it the pre-game emergency response rehearsal. Pre-game. I know there's a totally different meaning for the word pre-game, but the way I look at it, this is an emergency response rehearsal before the real deal happens. And I kind of liken it to people in the law enforcement officers, firefighters, people in the military, where they will prepare, they would train, they would simulate different kinds of scenarios, and then they would prepare. This is important for mission critical systems, especially, again, coming up with the assumption that this is change freeze. People are out and about, they're probably on holiday vacations, so you have to come up with an emergency response rehearsal where the assumption is the most junior guy is the only person available on the team. Now, I would not, I'll say it again, I would not let the junior person on the team deal with it without proper preparation. Unfortunately, the reality is You've just been told to build an always on available group. Now it's your responsible to maintain it without you knowing how to even deal with it. Okay, I would not let a junior staff be the only person on call dealing with mission critical systems and databases during change freeze, whereas the most senior guy, the senior escalation guy, is on vacation, or maybe stuck in traffic because it's the 24th of December and he's waiting to go home and you can't get a call, or you can't get him on the phone. So come up with a pre-game emergency response rehearsal, build a team, and again, we don't know, right? Even if they're assigned on call, they may be stuck in traffic, or they may not have any cell phone signals when you're calling them. Have your most senior person on the team, build a I want to say test environment, simulating how your production environment looks like, not necessarily the compute resources, simulating how or emulating how your production environment looks like, and then cause issues. And then using the emergency response checklists or run books, you guide them, or let your senior engineer, most senior engineer or DBA, guide them through what steps to take, practice, rehearse, and make it more realistic. Let's say the most junior person on the team is in the office while the most senior person is working from home, and let's say something happened. How are they going to escalate? And then let the senior engineer walk them through the process of bringing stuff online, bringing the databases online, bringing the systems online as they're going through the checklist. There's two things that's happening there. One, you're validating that your emergency response, let me go back to that, your emergency runbook is being validated. Okay, you're verifying and validating that your emergency runbook is exactly what you need it to be when an emergency happens. And two, you're also preparing the most junior staff to be ready when an emergency happens, knowing exactly what they need to do. Plus, okay, they're not in a time crunch. They can take their time. Again, this is rehearsal. They can take their time, rehearse, get the feel of the situation until they're ready to do it again and again and again, without jeopardizing your production system, so that by the time the real emergency happens, they're not panicking. They're not, like these deer in the headlight situation where they don't know what to do, they don't have run books, they don't have a step-by-step process on what to do and to deal with. They don't have anybody to call because the senior guy was on vacation. Get them ready, okay? Get them ready so that when something goes really bad during emergency or during change freeze, they can crack open what they call the break glass in case of fire situation. They can do that because it's rehearsed. They know exactly what to expect. And of course, it is up to them to really take care of the way they respond to the situation, because that's not something that we can rehearse, or that's not something we can control, rather. It's up to the person to be calm and composed when a real emergency happens, because that's what dictates how they respond during an emergency. So here, these are what I call the three things that you need. I didn't really say three things, but what I call the DBA's change freeze survival guide, where you have to prepare for your change freeze period by starting off with a database health check or the database platform health check. Not just the database, but the entire platform your database is on top of. Do that before change freeze. Come up with pre-approved emergency run books where you can come up with incident response checklists and emergency access procedures. And the last one is the pre-game emergency response rehearsal, where you are preparing your most junior person on staff, the person who will be there during the change freeze period, and let them be ready. Let the most senior guy guide them through or walk them through the emergency run book that they need to follow, simulating the incident, simulating the emergency until they're ready. Okay. Change freeze is going to happen for some people. Some people will take this time to relax a bit. But again, if you're in an industry where change freeze change freeze becomes the busiest time for your systems, not necessarily for your staff, right? But for your systems, we got to be ready. You got to be ready that you have the right procedures. You got to be ready for making sure that your entire database platform is stable, reliable, and highly available. And you also have to make sure that the people who are left during the holiday seasons are taking care of the entire systems, are prepared, they're ready, they have the right skills, the capabilities to take care of what could potentially happen or emergencies. That is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Tune in again next week for another episode. And if you need help with anything related to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery, use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session and let's talk. This link will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. There's two things that are happening during what I call the strategy session. One, we'll get clear on the challenges that you're facing, the problems, the issues, the pressing ones that are preventing you from actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. Like for instance, in the case of always on availability groups, you're now given the responsibility to take care of it, but you don't know how it works, you don't know how to deal with it, how to manage it. We'll find out the challenges, the problems, and the issues. The second part of it is giving you the strategy on how to achieve or how to resolve those issues and how to achieve your goals. And if I can help, I will. If not, I will steer you in the direction that will help serve you best. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and looking forward to having that talk and conversation, right? Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again in the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show.